The book of Ruth begins in the days when the judges ruled. At this time in Israel's history, God would regularly raise up military and political leaders to save Israel from their enemies. But each time the danger passed, the people would forget God, and another crisis would soon present itself. The book of Judges, which comes right before Ruth, ends with a downward spiral of increasing conflict. And the words, "In those days, there was no king in Israel, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes." If the book of Judges is largely about the people of Israel not living into their covenant with God under the law, then Ruth is about people going above and beyond the requirements of the law. Ruth, a foreigner, a Moabite, is not required to follow the laws of Israel. She's married an Israelite man who's living in Moab, but when he dies, the expected thing is that she will return to her parents' home. This is what her sister-in-law Orpah does, and it's what Naomi, her widowed mother-in-law, who's returning to Bethlehem after years in Moab, urges her to do. But Ruth chooses to demonstrate hesed, or faithful loving kindness, instead. She chooses to enter into the covenant of Israel's God out of love for her mother-in-law. "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Ruth, a foreigner, chooses to join her story to God's story and to the story of God's people. The outsider is the faithful one, expressing her commitment to God and his people. Ruth chooses the life of being a stranger in a foreign land. She chooses to leave all that she has known and go to a place she's never been with no assurance of security. She is well aware of the cost of accompanying Naomi. Ruth will face the constant, subtle, and not so subtle reminders that she is not one of us. She will be viewed with suspicion. She will be subject to exploitation. She will have no one on whom to rely for safety. But such is her devotion and loyalty to Naomi and Naomi's land and Naomi's God. Ruth's devotion and faithful loving kindness stir the same response in Boaz. It turns out Ruth, now living with Naomi in Bethlehem, has been gleaning in Boaz's field, and he notices her. When he discovers that this young woman is Ruth, he blesses her, telling her, "I've heard of your devotion to Naomi." He offers her protection and food. And when Ruth later tells Naomi all these things, Naomi expresses hope for the first time. She offers up a blessing on Boaz, and she explains to Ruth that he is a relative of theirs. God has not abandoned Naomi, as she claimed on her return to Bethlehem. Instead, God's faithful loving kindness, God's hesed, has been incarnated for her, first in Ruth and now in Boaz. Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, a near relative who's obligated by the law to care for his impoverished relatives. For the first time, Naomi sees a way forward, and she instructs Ruth on how to approach Boaz. In an encounter at the threshing floor, Ruth actually proposes to Boaz. And after some family drama around right of first refusal, loose ends are tied up, and Boaz marries Ruth. They have a son, and Naomi becomes his nurse. Naomi's life of loss and hopelessness has been redeemed into one of new life and a family line. Just as the first verse of the book of Ruth links it to what came before the time of the judges, the last verses link it to what will come after. Obed, the son of Boaz and Ruth the Moabite, will become the grandfather of King David. The story of Ruth is a story of God's faithful, loving kindness lived out in the lives of everyday, ordinary human beings like you and me. It's a story of how God works through us in relationship with one another to be agents of his care. God never intervenes directly in the book of Ruth. He doesn't appear as a divine presence or speak from a burning bush. Instead, God acts through circumstance and through the faithfulness of ordinary folks. Naomi thought God had punished her in the loss of her husband and sons and had abandoned her in her desperate circumstance. But even as Naomi gave up all hope, telling her friends that the Lord had dealt bitterly with her, God was working through the people around her. Ruth, in her loyalty and steadfast care, reverses the trajectory of Naomi's life from despair and death to fertility and hope. Boaz, in his generosity and integrity, makes room in his life to care for those for whom he is responsible. In the relationship among Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, we see what it means to make and keep promises, what it means to be loyal, and what it means to serve and look out for one another. God is intimately involved in our relationships. Through the care that we extend to and receive from one another, we encounter God's grace. God weaves simple gestures and decisions and actions in ways that bring about the good. God's desire is that we be courageously and faithfully relational. The story of Ruth is also the story of God's fierce inclusivity. It speaks to the possibilities that can emerge when we live beyond the walls that would define us and confine us. Just as Ruth was not restricted in her love of Naomi by ethnic or religious boundaries, so the community of God in Bethlehem embraced Ruth as one of their own. God is the God of the lowly, the widow, the stranger, and the refugee. God is the God of all people. And more than this, God can work across the most entrenched positions and boundaries, using outsiders to be agents of his providential care, using the unlikely to bring new hope and new life. In a world where we can be unwilling to extend ourselves on behalf of others and risk being changed for the better by the encounter, the story of Ruth challenges us to open our hearts and our minds. Ruth pushes us to reassess our understanding of insiders and outsiders, to be open to difference, and to remember that our God, who welcomes a stranger, calls us to do the same. Today at the 11 a.m. service, we will be confirming folks into this particular people of God. We will challenge them to come among us with their gifts and their ministries to be actively involved in the life of this congregation. But more than this, we challenge ourselves to be a people who continues to welcome the newcomer, knowing that it is God's desire that we help them find their place among us. We need each other, those who are new and those who are long-standing, to help one another become the people God has created us to be, and to work together to bring about his purposes for the world. In today's story, the loyalty and devotion of the stranger, Ruth the Moabite, is grafted into and is necessary to the line of David, which is, of course, the line of Jesus. As we leave today, may we do so with the understanding that as followers of Jesus, We are called to live out faithful, loving kindness, not only with those who we know well and who are dear to us, but with those whose paths cross ours, regardless of their provenance. Amen.